Every holiday, my wife's parents hijacked our plans, declaring, "You'll spend it with us or forget about family altogether." My wife just rolled her eyes and said, "It's easier to just go along." I smirked and replied, "Sure, but first, I've got a little something to show you all." As the video played on the TV, their confident grins morphed into absolute shock. Let's make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep the channel alive and well. Every holiday, without fail, my wife's family would assert their ownership over the calendar like it was a prize they had fought for and won, dictating where we'd go, what we'd eat, who would cook, and, most importantly, who got the final word. It didn't matter that we had plans of our own, that we had friends inviting us elsewhere, or that I wanted to visit my parents for once. To them, the only correct way to spend Thanksgiving, Christmas, or even 4th of July was in their over-decorated living room, following their exact routines, and pretending that the occasional insults passed across the table were just teasing. The first few years of our marriage, I went along with it because I figured it was temporary, that maybe once the newlywed novelty wore off, things would settle and we'd negotiate something more balanced. But every time I brought it up, my wife would sigh, brush it off, and say the same thing. It's easier to just go along. She wasn't wrong. Resisting her parents came with consequences. If we skipped one holiday, we'd be guilt-tripped for months. Her father would stop answering calls. Her mother would send passive-aggressive texts about how empty the house feels this year. And her sisters would team up in the group chat with veiled remarks about family loyalty. No matter how tactfully we tried to carve out our own space, we were always dragged back into the same suffocating cycle, over-planning, underappreciating, overstepping. I started to notice how every invitation wasn't really an invitation. It was a demand wrapped in tradition. If we hesitated, even for a second, the claws came out. At first, I tried to bring my concerns to my wife gently, not because I didn't want to cause friction, but because I genuinely hoped she would see how isolating it was for me, how I was constantly put in a position of either submitting to their control or being painted as the difficult son-in-law. Her response was always the same. She'd roll her eyes and tell me I was overthinking it, that they meant well, that it wasn't worth the fight. "It's just easier," she'd say, like that was supposed to be enough. This last Christmas, something changed. It wasn't just the pressure. It wasn't even the hypocrisy of being told that family matters most, while being treated like an outsider in my own marriage. It was the realization that my silence had been interpreted as agreement. They had grown confident, arrogant even, convinced that I would never push back, never speak up, never do anything other than show up, smile, and let them walk all over both of us. And when her father pulled us aside 2 days before Christmas dinner and said, "We expect you here, if you want to still be considered family," I didn't get angry. I didn't protest. I just nodded, smiled, and said, "Sure, we'll be there." My wife looked relieved, like she thought I was finally learning to adapt. But I wasn't adapting. I was planning. For the next 48 hours, I didn't mention it again. I packed the car with the gifts her mother demanded we bring. I helped organize the casserole her sister requested, and I wore the sweater they mailed us in advance so the family photos looked coordinated. I kept my head down. I smiled at the right times. I played the part. And on the drive to their house, while my wife fiddled with the playlist, I thought about how long it had taken me to collect everything, how much footage I'd reviewed, how many screenshots I'd saved, how many times I bit my tongue while quietly recording every word. Over the past year, I had stopped trying to change their behavior, and I started archiving it instead. When we arrived, nothing seemed out of place. The same plastic smiles, the same heavy cologne in the hallway, the same fake warmth disguised as hospitality. Her mother kissed us on the cheek and called me dear, the way she always did before cutting me down mid-dinner. Her sisters were already sipping wine and gossiping about coworkers. Her father clapped me on the back with that smug grin that said, "We own you." My wife leaned in and whispered, "Let's just get through it." And I whispered back, "Absolutely. But first, I've got a little something to show you all." I said it lightly, casually, like it was a joke, and they all chuckled politely and returned to their drinks. No one asked what I meant. After dinner, when everyone had settled in around the television for the usual post-meal movie, I stood and asked if we could watch something else, just for a few minutes. They groaned, assuming I was about to suggest some sentimental home video or YouTube compilation, but they relented. My wife looked confused, but didn't stop me. I turned on the TV, connected my laptop, and hit play. The first clip was from Thanksgiving, her mother mocking my job at the table while I was in the other room. "Well, he stares at a screen all day, doesn't he? I'm not sure that counts as real work." Laughter. Agreement. A toast. The second was her father saying, on a phone call with his brother, "I don't know what she sees in him, but at least he does what we say." The third was a series of texts between her sisters, screen recorded in slow scroll. "He's not family, not really. She'll figure it out eventually. Yeah, if she doesn't, we'll make sure she does." I didn't say a word. I just stood in front of the screen and let it run. One clip after another, one timestamp after another, one private moment after another made painfully public. I watched their faces shift in real time, from bored amusement to recognition, from recognition to disbelief, and from disbelief to panic. My wife went pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her mouth. Her mother opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her father stood up, jaw clenched, but didn't move. And I stood there, expression flat, letting them all soak in the reality they had built around themselves, now reflected back with perfect clarity. As the last video ended, the room remained quiet in that awful, exposed way that makes silence feel like a scream. No one moved. The television screen had faded to black, the remote still in my hand, but I didn't switch it off. I didn't need to say anything. I had already said enough without opening my mouth. The evidence had done the talking for me, and now every person in that room was stuck trying to piece together how it had gotten to this point, how a man they'd spent years minimizing had just seized complete control of the moment they thought they owned. My wife was still staring at the screen, lips parted slightly, her face frozen in that uncomfortable space between confusion and realization. I could tell she hadn't known, at least not the full extent of it. She had sensed things, sure. She'd even acknowledged it in passing, dismissing their jabs as just the way they are, but now she was seeing the unedited version of her family. The version I had lived with silently. The version she had tolerated. The version she had allowed to sink its hooks into our marriage with every holiday she insisted we attend, every insult she let slide, every decision she let them override. Her father was the first to break the silence, and not with an apology. He took a step forward, his voice low but sharp, asking what I thought I was doing, as if I had violated some unspoken contract by airing their dirty laundry in front of the very people who had made the mess. His tone wasn't angry in the way you'd expect from someone who had just been exposed. It was indignant, the kind of fury that only comes from someone who's lived too long believing they're untouchable. He said I had disrespected his home, his family, his daughter, that whatever issues I had, I should have brought them to him like a man, not snuck around like some bitter coward recording private conversations. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him for a few seconds, letting him finish his rehearsed righteousness, and then I asked him what part of the footage was untrue. That stopped him. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. His wife looked away. One of the sisters fidgeted with her phone, pretending to be busy, but there was nothing left to scroll past. The truth had already taken the air out of the room, and now they were just scrambling to survive the vacuum. My wife finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, brittle at the edges, the way it gets when someone's entire framework of belief has started to collapse. She asked me why I didn't tell her sooner, why I hadn't shown her all of this privately. It was a fair question, and I could have given her a dozen logical answers. I could have said I needed proof, or that I knew she wouldn't believe me without seeing it all in context, or that I needed the timing to be right. But the truth was simpler than that. She had always known enough to act, and she never did. I told her I didn't show her sooner because I was tired of playing the long game alone. I told her this wasn't about catching them in a lie. It was about forcing everyone in that house to confront the consequences of their choices in a way they could no longer spin or dismiss or bury under tradition. Her mother started crying, or at least trying to. It wasn't grief, it was discomfort. The kind of crying people do when their reality is being peeled away in front of others, not because of pain, but because they've been caught. She said something about how we had always been welcome, how she never meant to hurt me, how things get misinterpreted sometimes when you take them out of context. I reminded her that the context was her own dining room, her own living room, her own phone, that she wasn't being misquoted, she was being revealed. One of the sisters, the one who had sent the most vicious messages, muttered that maybe I shouldn't have married into a family I clearly hated. I told her she was right. I shouldn't have. But I hadn't married her. I had married someone who swore she wasn't like them, someone who promised she saw me, someone who rolled her eyes at the ugliness and told me it wasn't who they really were. And maybe, at some point, she believed that. But sitting here now, I said, if she could still say that, then maybe the problem was no longer them. Maybe it was her. That landed. I saw it in her face, the way she flinched, not out of anger, but recognition. Something in her shifted, or at least cracked. Maybe it was the realization that all the eye-rolling in the world doesn't absolve you from complicity. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the moment she realized I wasn't just confronting her family. I was confronting the part of her that enabled them. The rest of the night blurred into quiet chaos. No yelling, no physical confrontations, just cold, measured unraveling. Her father stormed out of the room, saying something about how he didn't need to be disrespected in his own house. Her mother followed a few minutes later. The sisters stayed for a while, whispering between themselves, not looking at either of us. Eventually, they left too. The living room was empty, except for the remnants of the dinner we'd eaten earlier and the faint smell of pine from the over-decorated tree in the corner. My wife and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, neither of us speaking, both staring at the dark screen. I didn't say anything else that night. I didn't need to. The video had already said everything I had been trying to say for years. I went upstairs, packed our things, and loaded the car. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She just sat there, watching me move, and then followed me silently when I told her we were leaving. We drove back to our apartment in silence. No music, no talking, just the sound of the highway and the knowledge that something between us had shifted permanently. When we got home, I unpacked the car and went straight to the bedroom. She stayed in the living room. I could hear her pacing for a while, opening and closing drawers, probably trying to figure out what came next. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't make any declarations. I just let the silence sit, because for the first time in years, it was mine. Not filled with passive-aggressive noise, not hijacked by guilt or pressure or expectation. Just silence, clean and deserved. The days that followed weren't explosive. They were quiet. Too quiet. And in that stillness, something far heavier began to grow. My wife didn't speak much after we got home. There were no late-night fights, no sudden breakdowns, no attempts to reverse what had already been set in motion. She moved through the apartment like someone trying not to set off a minefield, polite and cautious, but increasingly distant. I didn't press her. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't ask her to choose sides, because at that point, the choice had already been made. For years, she had chosen peace over partnership, convenience over confrontation, and now she was starting to feel the weight of that decision in a way she couldn't ignore. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was surgical, clean, clinical. She cooked her meals, I cooked mine. She worked from the bedroom, I took calls from the living room. We passed each other in the hallway like neighbors sharing the same floor, but not the same life. And still, no apology, no acknowledgement. Just this quiet resentment simmering beneath the surface, not just toward me, but toward herself. Because I think, deep down, she knew that this wasn't something she could blame on me. She had seen the footage, heard the voices, read the messages. She couldn't pretend anymore that her family's cruelty was exaggerated or accidental. And she couldn't pretend that she hadn't been warned. Her parents didn't reach out. Not once. Her father didn't call to defend himself. Her mother didn't send one of her saccharine, checking-in texts. The sisters went silent on all channels. They closed ranks completely, which told me everything I needed to know about how they planned to spin it. To them, we had attacked. We had betrayed. We had embarrassed them in front of their own curated social circle. And their solution wasn't reflection, it was exile. My wife's phone stayed quiet, and with each day that passed, I could see the truth weighing on her. She wasn't just losing her family. She was realizing they never really saw her either. Not as her own person. Not as someone with her own needs, her own marriage, her own identity. She had been their extension, their reflection, their golden child who played along. And the moment she broke rank, even passively, she was dropped like a liability. One night, for days after the dinner, she finally spoke. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, both pretending to be watching something, though neither of us had reacted to the screen in over an hour. She set down the remote, turned slightly toward me, and asked, quietly, was I really that blind? I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have one, but because I wanted her to sit with the question. Eventually, I said, you weren't blind. You just didn't want to look. She nodded, slowly, and said nothing else for the rest of the night. The following morning, I woke up early. She wasn't in bed. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. The screen was blank. She wasn't reading anything, just holding it, locked, like she was waiting for something that would never come. She asked me if I was going to leave. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just said, okay, and stood up to go shower. That was when I knew how deep it had hit her. Not because she didn't fight, but because she couldn't. There was nothing left to say that would make any of it easier. I started taking walks alone. Long ones. After work. Before breakfast. Whenever the silence in the apartment started to feel too heavy. I used to think that time would help, that distance would shrink the damage, but the opposite was true. The more space I put between myself and that dinner, the clearer everything became. It wasn't just about the recording. It wasn't about the footage or the insults or the way her family dismissed me like I was a placeholder. It was about how long I had been made to feel like a guest in my own relationship. How long I had smiled through forced traditions, rearranged my life for other people's expectations, and let myself be erased one holiday at a time. I stopped checking in, stopped making plans, stopped trying to hold things together. And she noticed. She started cooking more elaborate meals, small gestures of routine, like some part of her thought consistency would make me feel at home again. But the foundation was already cracked. She asked me one evening if I still loved her. I told her that I didn't know, that what I felt now wasn't hate or anger, it was exhaustion. She didn't push the conversation any further. That weekend, she left town for 2 days. She said she was visiting a friend, someone from college. I didn't ask for details. I didn't ask when she'd be back. When she returned, she brought back a box of my favorite coffee and placed it on the counter without a word. I never opened it. A week later, we sat down at the kitchen table. She said she had been thinking a lot, that she didn't know how to fix it, that she didn't know if it could be fixed. She said she finally understood how much I had tolerated, that it wasn't fair, that she hadn't protected me, that she had always asked me to make it easier for her, but never made it easier for me. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said she wanted me to decide what happened next. She said she trusted me to make the right choice, whatever it was. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not out of cruelty, not out of vengeance, but because for the first time in our marriage, she had finally handed me the control I should have had all along, and by then, it was already too late to use it for repair. After that conversation at the kitchen table, neither of us said anything else about what came next. She gave me space, and I took it. The air between us no longer felt tense, just quiet in that terminal kind of way. Like we were already two separate people, still sharing the same space only because it hadn't yet been divided legally or logistically. The coffee she had bought remained unopened on the counter. The refrigerator was full of things we no longer made together. Her shoes still sat by the front door, but I stopped noticing them when I walked past. The life we had built didn't collapse. It faded. I started packing on a Thursday. Not all at once. Just a few drawers, my books, the documents I knew I'd need. She came home while I was halfway through organizing my things, paused in the doorway, saw what I was doing, and said nothing. She stepped around the boxes, poured herself a glass of water, and went into the bedroom. There were no fights, no accusations. Just two people who had both run out of ways to pretend the damage was temporary. That night, she asked if I needed help. I said no. She nodded and went to bed early. By Saturday, I was done. Everything that was mine was packed, labeled, and waiting by the door. I'd rented a short-term place on the other side of town, a furnished unit, quiet, month-to-month lease. I didn't need anything more than that. I'd arranged for movers the following morning. She didn't ask where I was going, and I didn't volunteer the information. We had stopped asking questions we weren't prepared to hear the answers to. The last thing I took down was a framed photo of us from 3 years ago, back when her parents still pretended to like me. We were both smiling, standing on her father's porch, arms linked, unaware that everything surrounding us was already designed to push me out. I didn't take the photo with me. I set it on the kitchen counter face down and left it there. She didn't sleep in our bed that night. I heard her settle into the guest room, the door closing gently behind her. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much of this had been inevitable. Whether anything I said earlier in our relationship would have changed the outcome. Whether a firmer boundary set 2 years ago would have changed the way her parents treated me. But even as I asked the questions, I knew the answer. They didn't care who I was. They just cared that I wasn't theirs. And she didn't care enough to challenge them. In the morning, I woke before the sun. I took one last look around the apartment, not out of sentimentality, but to make sure I hadn't missed anything. I brewed one final cup of coffee, stood by the window, and watched the city wake up beneath a gray sky. She emerged from the guest room, wearing a sweatshirt and slippers. She looked tired but calm. We didn't say good morning. We didn't hug. She asked if the movers were still coming at 9. I said yes. When they arrived, she opened the door without being asked. She held it open while they carried my boxes out. She didn't flinch when they carted out the desk we had built together, or the chair she used to read in, or the kitchen knives I had bought after her mother said ours were embarrassingly dull. She just stood there, hands in her sleeves, watching quietly. When the last box was gone and the door closed behind them, I stood in the living room, keys in my hand, and looked at her for what I knew would be the last time. She didn't cry. Neither did I. She asked if I'd let her know when I was settled. I said I'd think about it. Then I handed her a manila envelope with the separation papers already signed. All she had to do was review them, add her signature, and file them. I told her she could keep the apartment. She didn't thank me. Before I left, she asked one last question. She asked if I'd meant to blow everything up that night at her parents' house. If that had been the plan all along. I told her no. That night hadn't been the beginning of the end. It had been the end of the pretending that they were harmless, that I was accepted, that we could bend tradition without breaking. That silence was survival. She asked if I hated her. I said I didn't. I told her I was just tired of choosing someone who never chose me back when it counted. Then I walked out, closed the door behind me, and didn't look back. The new apartment was quiet, unfurnished but clean, the kind of space where nothing echoed but your own breath. I unpacked only the essentials: clothes, laptop, a single coffee mug. I went out that night and bought new bed sheets. Something plain, no color associations, no shared memories, just fabric and sleep. Weeks passed. I got used to the silence. I filled it with whatever I wanted. Music, books, nothing. I slept better, woke up without dread, made plans without clearing it with anyone else. No more holidays hijacked. No more family power plays. No more forced smiles over turkey and dry wine. When Thanksgiving came around again, I stayed home, made pasta, watched a movie, turned off my phone. No guilt, no pressure, just quiet. She never filed the paperwork. Not right away. Maybe she thought I'd change my mind. Maybe she thought I'd come back. Eventually, she did it. I got a copy in the mail 6 weeks later. No note inside. Just a stamp, a signature, and a date. Years from now, I doubt I'll remember the exact words I said that night. I won't remember what we ate. I won't remember what sweater her mother wore, or whether it was snowing. But I'll remember the feeling of watching their faces change when the video started playing. I'll remember the slow, creeping shock in the room as they realized that for the first time, I hadn't come quietly. They thought they had taught me to stay quiet, to behave, to keep the peace, to be grateful for the scraps they offered. But what they didn't realize was that every time they pushed me down, they were teaching me where to strike back. Not with noise, not with fury, but with proof. I didn't burn the house down. I just turned on the lights. And I walked out the front door with the only thing they couldn't take from me, my self-respect.